I didn't ask for much. Just a corner in the house I helped pay for. Just a cup of tea when my hands couldn't hold the mug. Just a kind word when the heart ached at night. But instead, I was handed a list of duties, as if I had become a janitor again, as if my age wasn't a reason for respect, but an excuse for commands. When she said it was now my duty to serve the man of the house, I didn't argue. I simply left, with my suitcase, and with the dignity they had forgotten. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Whitman. I was 74 years old when I moved into my daughter's house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I had once been a carpenter, then a warehouse foreman, and later a school bus driver when my knees began to protest the years of lifting and bending. By the time I retired, my hands had memorized the texture of every kind of wood, and my back had its own weather forecast. After my wife passed, the old brick house we shared for 37 years felt cavernous. The echoes of her slippers on the kitchen floor still crept into my ears each morning, even though she was no longer there to fill the rooms with coffee and quiet humming. I didn't want to be a burden. I told myself I was being practical. The roof needed more than I could give it. The water heater coughed more than it warmed, and the neighborhood had changed from the one we built a life in. Still, when I locked the door for the last time, I stood on the porch a few minutes longer than I needed to. My hand lingered on the wood I had sanded a dozen summers ago. That doorframe had measured the height of my grandchildren in pencil notches I couldn't bring myself to erase. When I arrived at my daughter's house, I carried just 2 bags and a coat folded over my arm. It was a newer place, in a suburban neighborhood where every lawn looked clipped by the same hand. The trees were young, planted in straight rows, their branches still too thin to cast real shade. Her husband answered the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I knew then that this arrangement was for her peace of mind, not his. They gave me the upstairs room, the one above the garage, with 2 narrow windows that looked out over the backyard and a chain-link fence. The room was clean, but hollow, like a hotel suite nobody had stayed in. The bed was too soft, the walls too white. There were no creaks in the floorboards, no comforting hum of an old radiator. I unpacked in silence, folding my shirts into the drawers like I'd done in motels during work trips years ago. Only this time, there would be no drive home. I placed a framed photo of my wife on the nightstand. It was the same picture I had kept in my locker back at the depot. Her smile faded slightly from the years. I set my alarm clock beside it, even though I no longer had to wake up early. Habits are stubborn things. I opened the closet and found a row of boxes, labeled with labels that weren't mine. Old tax documents, holiday decorations, things that belonged to a life I wasn't part of. That first night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of their television below. Laughter would rise, a commercial would boom, then silence. I could hear the ice machine in the fridge kick in, the whir of the HVAC. No one checked on me. No one asked if I needed an extra blanket or if the mattress was too soft for my back. I told myself that was fine. I didn't want to trouble anyone. The next morning, I rose with the sun. Old bodies don't sleep late. I made my way down to the kitchen, careful to tread softly on the stairs. I made coffee. The good kind, not the flavored pods they used, but real grounds I brought in a tin. I drank it alone, looking out the kitchen window at the backyard. The grass was artificial. It didn't move in the wind. A plastic patio set sat unused, collecting a film of yellow pollen. My daughter came in later, surprised to see me up so early. She hugged me, asked if I'd slept well, and then immediately shifted to checking her phone. She had a meeting. The kids needed lunches packed. Her husband needed the car. Life was moving quickly around me, and I stood still in the center of it, like a tree that time had forgotten to cut down. I offered to help. Dishes, repairs, mowing. but she waved me off. "Just relax, Dad," she said without looking up. But relaxing felt like dying slowly. I needed purpose. For 50 years I had fixed things, driven things, built things. Now I was told to sit, to rest, to enjoy. But chairs are not companions, and silence is not purpose. Each evening I retreated to my room before dark. The house filled with their routines, music I didn't recognize, conversations that trailed off as I entered the room, doors that closed just a little too quickly. I wasn't unwelcome, but I wasn't exactly present either. I was tolerated, and tolerance, I discovered, was a colder place than loneliness. I began counting the birds that landed on the backyard fence each morning. Cardinals, mostly. One had a broken wing, but still came every day. I named him Walter. I imagined he had a story like mine, something once strong, now a little slower, still trying to be something useful in a world that had moved on. After a few weeks, I stopped using the downstairs bathroom. It felt like an intrusion. I showered in the upstairs one, where the water never quite got hot enough, and the fan made a clicking sound like a metronome marking the tempo of my decline. I kept my books stacked in a neat row on the dresser. Hemingway, Steinbeck, a Bible with my name embossed on the cover. I reread the same pages each night, not because I forgot what came next, but because those sentences still remembered me. Sometimes I heard my grandson playing in the backyard, but I didn't join him. The last time I tried, he had glanced at his mother first before answering me. That glance told me all I needed. He was learning the rules of the house, and I wasn't part of the game. So I watched. I listened. I waited. And upstairs, with my view of the plastic lawn and the young trees growing in someone else's rhythm, I began to understand that I hadn't been invited to live with them. I had been shelved. Each morning began the same way. I would wake before anyone else in the house, usually by 6, my body still trained to follow the rhythm of labor and obligation, even though there were no longer shifts to start or buses to warm up. I would sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening. There was always that early silence, the kind that existed before coffee pots sputtered or floorboards moaned under hurried feet. In that silence, I moved slowly, dressing in the clothes I had folded carefully the night before, always the same pair of slacks and a flannel shirt, the kind that held the scent of detergent long past its usefulness. I crept down the stairs like a trespasser, careful not to disturb the peace. The stairs creaked, no matter how lightly I stepped, and I often found myself pausing mid-step, holding my breath until the wood settled beneath me. In the kitchen, the world was untouched. Counters clean, chairs tucked in, the overhead light flickering faintly like it struggled to wake. I had one cup, a plain white ceramic one with a small chip on the rim. I found it buried in the back of their cabinet, behind a row of novelty mugs that said things like, "Jak to one dad," and "Don't talk until coffee." No one ever used it. It didn't match the rest, but it fit my hand like an old glove. It reminded me of the ones we had back home, before everything became curated and disposable. I filled the kettle with water, setting it carefully on the burner. They had a machine, one of those sleek silver things that took pods and blinked with unnecessary buttons, but I preferred the kettle. It hissed softly, gradually, like it was waking with me. While it heated, I'd open the tin of grounds I kept hidden in the pantry behind the cereal boxes. My own supply, a brand I had used for years. The smell alone brought comfort, like a voice I hadn't heard in a while but still recognized instantly. When the water boiled, I poured it slowly, watching the steam rise in curls. I never used sugar, just a splash of milk. I stirred with a spoon that always clinked the same way. That was my moment, a small act of control in a life that had steadily slipped from my grip. I would sit at the end of the table, facing the window, and drink in silence. Outside, the sky would shift from gray to light, birds would land on the wires, and the world would begin its day. But for a little while, it was only mine. After I finished, I washed the cup. Always. Even when my hands ached or my knees popped from standing too long. I washed it gently, like it might crack under pressure, rinsed it, and dried it with a towel that hung near the fridge. Then I'd place it back in the same spot, upside down, on the far right of the dish rack. No one ever moved it. No one ever used it. It was as invisible to them as I was. Sometimes my daughter would enter the kitchen mid-scroll, her fingers flicking through her phone as if searching for something more interesting than the man who raised her. She would glance up briefly, murmur a soft "morning," and move on to her routine. Smoothies with chia seeds, almond milk, a blender that sounded like a jet engine. I would smile and nod, but she rarely looked again. Her husband never greeted me in the morning. If we crossed paths, he would grunt or pretend to check the thermostat. Once he asked if I could remember to rinse out the sink after making coffee. I told him I always did, but he was already gone before I could finish the sentence. I never touched their cups, never used their plates. I had one fork, one spoon, one bowl. I kept them in a drawer they didn't use. It wasn't that I was unwelcome, but the message was clear. Stay tidy, stay quiet, stay invisible. I adapted quickly. A man who worked in silence for decades doesn't expect applause. He expects structure. So I created my own. Mid-mornings were harder. The house would fill with sound, doors slamming, the hum of vacuum cleaners, Zoom calls echoing through thin walls. I stayed upstairs then, retreating like smoke back into a corner. I would read, or try to nap, but sleep was thin and broken, interrupted by memories I hadn't invited. The creak of a stair could bring back an entire Sunday morning from 1982. A voice on the radio could summon the scent of my wife's shampoo. I didn't fight these moments. I let them come. By noon, I'd return to the kitchen for a sandwich. I used only what was necessary: a slice of turkey, a piece of bread, a thin layer of mustard. I never touched what they hadn't offered. I never left a crumb. I ate standing, sometimes at the sink, looking out the same window. The backyard never changed. The artificial grass remained too green, too neat, like a lie nobody questioned. In the afternoons, I cleaned the porch, not because they asked, but because dust gathered, and I needed to feel useful. I trimmed the hedges once and overheard them later, wondering who had hired a landscaper. I didn't correct them, let them think the wind shaped the shrubs. Dinner was their domain. I never sat at the table unless invited, and that rarely happened. I would hear the clatter of plates, the laughter, the television humming in the background. I ate leftovers, if any, after they had gone upstairs, always alone, always quiet. I washed the plate, the fork, the cup, dried each one and returned them to their hidden drawer. One evening, I left my cup in the sink by mistake. Just once. The next morning, it had been moved to the dishwasher, still unwashed, as if its presence there was offensive, a break in the choreography of their spotless home. I took it back, washed it by hand, and never forgot again. That cup, chipped and plain, became a small shrine to everything I still controlled. I polished it. I guarded it. It became a symbol of the man I had been, the man I refused to stop being, even as the world around me turned sleek and digital and indifferent. Each day, as I washed it, I watched the water swirl down the drain. Sometimes I wondered how long it would take for someone to notice if I didn't come down one morning. If the cup stayed clean and dry, sitting untouched in its spot, would anyone ask why? Or would they simply think the old man had finally remembered how to disappear completely? It was a Wednesday morning when I saw it. A bright yellow sheet of printer paper fixed to the refrigerator door with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. I noticed it right away, not because of the color, but because of its unfamiliar presence in a space that rarely changed. The kitchen had always been a place of quiet repetition for me. The coffee, the cup, the dish rack. But now this piece of paper broke the rhythm. At first I thought it was a school list, maybe something for the kids, a menu or a chore chart. But as I stepped closer, the letters became clearer, printed in bold, cheerful font. The title read, Household Responsibilities. Below it, a list of names, my daughter, her husband, the children, and next to each name, a set of tasks. Dishes, laundry, grocery runs. Their names were typed in blue. Then there was my name, Dad, printed in red ink. Next to it, a longer list. Take out the trash every morning. Clean the upstairs bathroom. Rake leaves on Sundays. Vacuum hallways twice a week. Clean the windows once a month. Keep pantry organized. Supervise the children's homework after school if available. No other list had that many items. I stood there for a long moment, reading it again and again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more dignified. But they didn't. I wasn't being asked. I wasn't being invited to help. I was being assigned. I didn't hear anyone come in, but eventually I felt her presence behind me. My daughter's voice filled the air like an echo I couldn't place. She said something about streamlining the household, how everyone needed to pitch in more, especially with how busy things had become lately. She used the word fair twice. She didn't wait for me to respond. She left with her smoothie and her keys, the front door clicking behind her like punctuation. I remained still, eyes on the list, my name bleeding out of that red ink like a warning. I wasn't upset about the work itself. I had done far more for far less in my life. But there was something different about seeing my name printed like that. As if I were an employee. As if I had applied for a position and had been accepted conditionally. I wasn't family. I was now part of an operational system, and my value depended on whether or not I remembered to vacuum the upstairs hallway. That afternoon, I took out the trash as expected. I cleaned the bathroom even though I hadn't used it that day. I raked the front yard even though the trees hadn't shed enough to warrant it. I followed the list, not because I agreed with it, but because I needed to understand what they saw when they looked at me. I began to notice small changes everywhere. Labels appeared on drawers. A whiteboard showed up in the hallway, detailing the week's goals for the house. My drawer of dishes was now labeled Dad's items, and someone had placed a note next to it that read, "Please rinse thoroughly before putting away." As if I hadn't done that every day without being told. There were new expectations now. I was no longer thanked for small things. Fixing the broken light fixture in the pantry earned no recognition. Unclogging the sink was met with silence. Replacing batteries in the thermostat only brought a comment about keeping the house warmer during the day to save on bills. One evening, I overheard a conversation between my daughter and her husband. They spoke in low tones, but I heard my name. He said something about managing Dad's presence. She said, "We just need to keep things structured so he doesn't slip." I didn't know what that meant. Slip into what? Laziness? Confusion? Irrelevance? It was clear now that I was being measured. My worth here was tied to output, and the output was determined by someone else. The tasks weren't difficult. What was difficult was the cold, quiet transaction that had begun to shape my role in the house. I found myself watching the list each morning like a time card. I completed each task with precision, making sure nothing could be criticized. But I stopped asking questions. I stopped volunteering. I performed, but I no longer participated. There was a moment, a small one, but it stayed with me, when I was scrubbing the upstairs sink. I looked into the mirror and saw myself, hunched slightly, with a rag in one hand and a spray bottle in the other. For a second, I didn't recognize the man in the glass. He looked like a janitor who had wandered into someone else's life. I began to avoid the kitchen in the afternoons. I waited until everyone had eaten before stepping in. I refilled my tin of coffee from the store, quietly, without mentioning it. I used the back door to sweep the porch and brought in the mail without a word. The refrigerator list remained, untouched. No one adjusted it. No one added or removed anything. The paper began to curl at the corners. The magnet shifted a little, but it stayed where it was, a silent declaration of who belonged and in what way. At night, I sat in my room, watching the shadows stretch across the ceiling, thinking of all the years I had spent providing, solving, building. I remembered the mornings I left before sunrise to put food on the table for the very people who now assigned me chores, like I was a stranger working off a debt. I thought about taking the list down, about crumpling it, burning it, burying it. But I didn't. That would have required a confrontation. And I had learned long ago that silence, in the right hands, could be more powerful than protest. So I left it there, but I stopped looking at it. It started the way most of my Saturdays did, with stillness. I woke early, as always, before the rest of the house had stirred. The light that came through the blinds was pale and uncertain, the kind that left corners in soft shadow. I made my way downstairs, slow but steady, careful not to disturb the quiet too soon. It was still my habit to make coffee before anyone else was awake, to enjoy those rare moments of peace before the noise of the day unfolded. But this Saturday, the air in the house already felt different. There was movement behind closed doors, the distant thump of drawers being opened and shut, the low rhythm of voices speaking too quickly. I heard laughter, not cruel, but light and unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone visiting. When I stepped into the kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and cooked butter filled the room, and the countertops were already covered with half-prepared trays of food. I stood there for a second, unnoticed. My daughter brushed past me holding a dish of sliced fruit, mumbling something I didn't catch. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Her husband was bent over the oven, adjusting the rack with exaggerated precision, humming along to a song playing from the speaker on the counter. The children ran in and out, carrying napkins and paper plates. Everyone had a role, a task, a place in the rhythm of what was unfolding. Everyone but me. Eventually, I understood. They were hosting some sort of gathering, a brunch, maybe, or a backyard barbecue. I hadn't been told. No one had mentioned it during the week. But the evidence was all around me. Coolers filled with ice and soda cans, folding chairs stacked by the back door, the patio umbrella raised, and freshly cut watermelon placed on a tray like a summer magazine ad. I stood in the corner of the kitchen, holding my cup, unsure whether I was meant to stay or go. No one asked me to help. No one asked if I needed anything. I considered retreating back upstairs, but something made me stay. A stubbornness, maybe, or the thin hope that someone would eventually look my way and say, "Dad, could you?" By noon, guests began to arrive. Friends from their neighborhood, co-workers, couples with toddlers in tow. They came through the side gate and around the back, skipping the front door entirely. I watched through the kitchen window as they greeted one another with wide smiles and easy gestures, slipping into lawn chairs like regulars at a club. My daughter wore a sundress I didn't recognize. Her husband had changed into a polo shirt and khaki shorts. The kids raced around with water guns, their laughter sharp and bright. I walked out onto the back deck and stood for a moment, surveying the scene. The sun was high, the grass freshly trimmed, the barbecue sizzling. People walked past me without pause. One woman gave me a polite nod, but didn't stop. Another reached for a bottle of water from the cooler beside me and thanked the air. I felt like a ghost drifting through someone else's memory. I sat on a bench near the fence, out of the main path of conversation, where I could observe without obstructing. My hands rested in my lap, my cup empty now, the chip on its rim catching the light. I didn't know what to do with my face, whether to smile or keep it still. I wasn't sure how to position my body, whether to lean forward or rest back. The space around me shifted constantly, people moving in waves, but none of them moved toward me. There was a moment when my grandson ran past, laughing, chased by another boy his age. He looked at me as he passed, but didn't stop. His eyes didn't flicker with recognition or warmth. It was the look children give to trees, part of the environment, useful only for shade. Later, I heard one of the guests ask who I was. My daughter responded without pause. "That's my dad. He lives upstairs." The tone was flat, matter of fact, the same way one might describe a roommate or a tenant, not hostile, but distant, like explaining a detail that didn't require elaboration. That stung more than anything. I remained on that bench through most of the afternoon, shifting occasionally as the sun moved. The heat grew dense, and I could feel the sweat gather at the base of my neck. No one offered me a drink. No one asked if I was okay. My daughter walked past several times without turning her head. Once she placed a bowl of chips on a nearby table and said something funny to the people beside her. They laughed. She laughed. I didn't know what the joke was. I started to wonder if I was being punished for something. Maybe I had said too little. Maybe too much. Maybe it wasn't anything I had done, but simply the fact of my presence. An older man in a house built for newer lives. A misplaced item someone forgot to return. By early evening, the shadows had stretched across the yard. The food was gone. The children were tired. The folding chairs had been stacked again. People began to leave, waving, hugging, calling out thanks and goodbyes. I stood up, my knees aching, and made my way slowly toward the kitchen. My footsteps felt heavy, but no one noticed. They were busy cleaning, stacking plates, arguing over leftovers. Inside, I rinsed out my cup and dried it. I placed it back in the drawer with the care of someone preserving an artifact. I wiped the counter near the sink, even though it was already clean. I opened the back door, took one last look at the backyard, and climbed the stairs to my room. From my window, I could see the last of the guests pulling away in their cars. I watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner. The backyard was quiet again. The plastic chairs stood empty. The umbrella tilted slightly in the breeze. That night, I sat in the dark with the lamp off. The walls were cool to the touch. I tried to read, but the words blurred. I tried to sleep, but my body resisted. What lingered most wasn't the silence or the ache in my joints. It was the feeling that I had been present in every room, every moment, and yet somehow I had not existed at all. It was late, later than I usually stayed awake. The house had long since settled into its nighttime rhythm, the children tucked away in their beds, the hum of appliances fading into background static, the porch light casting its dull triangle across the front steps. I had climbed the stairs an hour earlier, moved through my routine, teeth brushed, shirt folded over the back of the chair, lamp dimmed to the familiar amber hue. I had been lying in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling and listening to the creaks of the house, when I heard the voices. They weren't loud at first, just the low murmur of conversation traveling through walls that had been built for insulation, not secrecy. At first I couldn't make out the words, and I assumed it was the television. But then the rhythm changed. Pauses, questions, the way people spoke when they thought the house was theirs alone. I sat up slowly, letting my bare feet touch the floor. I crossed the room and opened my door just enough to hear. The hallway outside was dim. A nightlight near the staircase cast a faint glow. Their bedroom was at the other end of the hall. The door wasn't fully shut. I could see a sliver of moving shadow. Their voices rose and fell, clearer now. She was speaking first. My daughter. Her voice had an edge I hadn't heard in a long time, tight and tired. She said she was overwhelmed, that there was too much going on, that having me in the house made things complicated, that the kids didn't understand why I was always there but not part of anything, that her husband was stressed, that she felt pulled in too many directions. Then came his voice, calm but clipped. He said I was taking up space, that I wasn't contributing, that I used electricity and hot water and left crumbs on the counter, that I didn't respect their rules, that I wasn't integrating, that it was like housing a stranger who expected something just because he shared a name. She didn't defend me. That's what stayed with me the most. He continued. He said I should be in a place with structure, somewhere with professionals, people trained to deal with the elderly. He said the phrase like a diagnosis. He said I was becoming a liability, that it wasn't sustainable, that they had done their part. I stood in the dark, still as a nail in wood, listening to the slow dismantling of the quiet understanding I had tried to build since I arrived. Each word felt like a measurement. How much I cost, how little I returned, how easily I could be boxed and moved. I hadn't realized I had been under evaluation. She said she felt guilty, that she didn't want to hurt me, but that she had children now, a husband, a mortgage. She said they had to think about the long term. She said it gently, as if careful phrasing would make it less cruel. But there is no soft way to say a man is no longer wanted. I leaned back against the doorframe and let the weight of their words settle into my chest. It was a strange sensation, not anger, not grief, but something more hollow. Like standing in a room you had built yourself and realizing someone had quietly started to dismantle it while you were sleeping. The conversation tapered off. Their voices grew quieter, replaced by the rustle of blankets and the final sighs of a day closing in on itself. I closed my door and returned to the bed, sitting on the edge like I had before. The ceiling looked the same, but it no longer felt neutral. It felt like a lid. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. I lay down eventually, but my body remained alert, like it had somewhere to be. My thoughts paced. I replayed memories I hadn't called up in years, teaching her how to ride a bike, fixing her first car, sitting in the bleachers at her high school graduation, carrying her boxes up 3 flights of stairs when she moved into her first apartment. No one had assigned me those tasks. I had done them because that's what fathers did. Now I was a burden. In the early hours, as the house remained still and the sky outside began to stretch with light, I found myself remembering my own father's final years. He had refused to move in with us, even when we offered. He said he had already lived his life and didn't want to be furniture in someone else's. I hadn't understood him then. I thought he was being stubborn. But sitting there in the quiet, I realized he had only been trying to hold on to something I had already let go of. His autonomy, his dignity. I rose before the sun, dressed quietly, and made my way downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The air was cool. I filled the kettle, lit the stove, and waited for the whistle. I made my coffee the same way I always did, but the cup felt heavier in my hand, like it knew something now, like it had changed shape overnight. I didn't look at the fridge. I didn't look at the list. I didn't want to see my name in red again. I took my coffee outside, sat on the back steps, and watched the world begin. The birds were louder than usual, or maybe I was just listening differently. The breeze was soft, but steady. The grass, artificial though it was, shimmered in the light. It occurred to me, not suddenly but slowly, that I would not stay here much longer, not because they would ask me to leave, but because I had already been told, in a voice through the hallway, that I no longer belonged. I woke before the sun, not from a dream, not from a sound, but from something quieter, a decision that had finally settled itself in my chest during the night. I had not reached it in anger. I had not cried or clenched my fists in the dark. I had simply lain there, flat on my back, watching the ceiling change colors with each passing hour until the room turned blue, and I understood what had to happen. I moved carefully, slowly, like a man rearranging his own life without waking the house that had forgotten him. My bones creaked with their usual commentary, but I didn't mind them this morning. I let them speak. I was still alive, still in control, still capable of lifting a suitcase when the moment called for it. The suitcase was under the bed, a brown canvas one with frayed corners and a handle that had been repaired with duct tape years ago during a road trip to visit my brother in Michigan. I had not used it since my wife's funeral. It still carried the smell of that trip, dust and old cologne, and something I couldn't name. I pulled it out with both hands, the wheels squeaking softly across the hardwood floor. I placed it on the bed and opened it. The sound of the zipper filled the room like the first word in a long overdue conversation. I stood there for a moment, looking into the empty space inside it, and thought about how strange it was to reduce a life to a bag. Not because I lacked possessions, but because so little of what I owned seemed mine anymore. I started with socks, 5 pairs, neatly rolled, placed into the corner. Then underwear, 2 pairs of slacks, 3 shirts, a sweater, even though the weather was still warm, because some part of me still planned for unexpected cold. I folded each item carefully, not out of neatness, but out of reverence. These were the clothes I wore when I still felt like someone. I packed my razor, my toothbrush, a bottle of aspirin, my Bible, the one with the spine cracked from years of use, and my name written inside in my wife's handwriting. A framed photo of her, wrapped in a t-shirt for protection. I hesitated before placing it in, not because I questioned whether to take it, but because I knew it would be the heaviest thing in the suitcase. There were small things I left behind, my slippers, worn thin at the heels, the books I had stacked beside the bed, the jacket that smelled like the garage I used to sit in for hours, pretending to fix things that didn't need fixing. I didn't need them anymore. I was not going somewhere new. I was leaving somewhere that had already decided I didn't belong. I wrote a note, not out of spite, not to explain myself, just a short sentence. Thank you for letting me stay. I folded it and left it on the dresser. No signature, no need for one. My handwriting was enough. The hallway outside my door was silent. The floor was cool beneath my feet. I carried the suitcase slowly, avoiding the third step that always creaked. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. The list was still taped to the door. My name, still in red, still marked beside tasks I would never complete again. I made a cup of coffee, my usual ritual, perhaps for the last time. I didn't rush. I stirred slowly. I stood by the window and watched the backyard where the artificial grass had grown no less green. The same 2 birds landed on the fence. One of them, I imagined, was Walter, the injured one. I gave him a silent nod. I sipped my coffee and felt no bitterness, only a strange, clean emptiness, the kind that comes not from loss, but from release. I had done all I could here. I had stood still long enough. I had waited for warmth that never came. Now I would go, not because they forced me, but because they didn't need to. I rinsed the cup, dried it, placed it back in the drawer with the others. The fork, the spoon, the plate. They belonged here more than I did now. I touched the handle of the suitcase and let my hand rest on it for a moment. Then I moved toward the door. The lock clicked louder than I expected. The air outside smelled like dew and sidewalk dust. A garbage truck groaned 2 streets over. A dog barked without conviction. Morning had arrived, but it was just another morning, unaware of what I carried inside the bag or inside my chest. I walked down the steps and paused at the bottom. I didn't look back. There was nothing theatrical in my leaving. No final glance, no silent farewell. Just the gravel beneath my feet and the stretch of road ahead. I didn't know where I would go, but I knew that wherever it was, I would carry less weight, less expectation, less silence pressed against my ribs like a hand refusing to let go. The suitcase rolled behind me like a loyal companion, and the door stayed closed. The walk to the bus station took me longer than it should have, but I didn't mind the pace. I wasn't in a hurry. Each step felt deliberate, as if my feet were learning how to carry me on their own again, without the weight of hesitation or someone else's approval pressing down on them. The suitcase rolled beside me with a soft rattle, its wheels occasionally catching on cracks in the sidewalk or patches of gravel. The morning sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows across the empty street. A few joggers passed, earbuds in, eyes straight ahead. No one looked at me. When I reached the station, I didn't go straight to the counter. I didn't check the schedule or ask about destinations. Instead, I found a bench near the edge of the platform, the kind made of metal slats that warmed quickly in the sun. I lowered myself onto it, feeling the stiffness in my knees as I adjusted to the hard seat. I placed the suitcase at my feet and rested my hands on top of it. The platform stretched out to either side, quiet and unremarkable, bordered by a chain-link fence and a few patches of brittle grass. I had no plan. That was the truth of it. No itinerary, no destination scribbled on a notepad. I had simply walked away from a place where I was no longer needed, and now I sat, waiting for the next thing, not knowing what that thing might be. There was something both terrifying and liberating in that. A pigeon landed nearby, pecking at the ground with mechanical indifference. A breeze swept through, carrying the faint smell of hot asphalt and fast food wrappers. In the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, though it was too far away to be the one I would take. I wasn't even sure if I'd board a train. The bench had become a kind of stop between two lives, and for now, it was enough. I sat still for a long time, letting the hours stretch. Around me, the world moved in small, predictable ways. Announcements over the intercom, a teenager arguing with someone on the phone, a janitor sweeping near the vending machines. But I was outside that rhythm, not invisible exactly, but unnoticed. People glanced at me the way you glance at a tree or a parking meter, present but not important. That was the part I had to grow used to, not the leaving, not the uncertainty, but the way time moved around me without slowing down. When I was younger, I believed there would be a point in life when everything made sense, when you earned the right to rest and be seen. But now I knew the truth. If you stopped fitting the roles others needed, they stopped seeing you entirely. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook I used to carry for odds and ends. Addresses, phone numbers, grocery lists. Most of the pages were blank. I tore one out and wrote a word in the center. Still. I didn't know why. It just felt right. I folded it twice and placed it back in the pocket. Some part of me liked the idea of carrying a single word that belonged only to me. Lunch hour came and went. The bench grew hot beneath me, and I shifted now and then to keep my legs from cramping. A bus arrived, hissed, opened its doors, swallowed people and pulled away. I didn't move. I wasn't ready yet, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't finished with the bench. It had become a kind of mirror, reflecting back a version of myself I hadn't seen in a long time. An older woman sat beside me briefly. She asked if I was waiting for the 115 westbound. I told her no. She nodded, didn't press, and eventually left. I appreciated that, the kindness of short silence. No advice, no pity, just presence. In the afternoon, the air turned dry and still. The shadows shortened, and the light became harsh and unfiltered. I removed my jacket and folded it across my lap. I drank from a small bottle of water I'd packed, the plastic warm to the touch. Each sip tasted like the end of something, though I couldn't say what. I thought about calling someone. I had numbers saved in my phone, old friends, distant cousins, people I hadn't spoken to in years. But the thought of explaining where I was and why didn't appeal to me. It felt too heavy, too soon. I wanted to arrive somewhere before I asked to be received. By mid-afternoon, I began to notice the sounds of travel again, the rolling suitcases, the questions at the ticket counter, the nervous rustle of itineraries in hands that had places to be. I remained still. No one asked if I needed help. No one asked if I was lost. That was a kind of gift. I knew I couldn't stay on the bench forever, but I also knew I didn't have to rush. There are rare moments in life when you are allowed to simply exist, unmeasured. That bench became one of them. It held my weight without question, offered me its hard surface without agenda. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in diluted oranges and tired blues, I finally stood. My legs ached. My back protested. But my hands were steady as I lifted the suitcase once more. I didn't know where I'd sleep that night. I didn't know what came next. But I had left. And I had waited. And I had listened to the world pass by without asking for anything in return. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had done something entirely my own. I found the church by accident, or maybe by something softer than accident, something slower, like quiet memory. After hours on that bench at the station, I stood and walked without direction. I didn't check a map or ask for help. I followed the way the light bent through the trees, the feel of my feet on the sidewalk, the pull of some old intuition that still lived in my bones. My suitcase rolled behind me like a shadow I couldn't shake. It was a small white church with peeling paint and a sign out front that hadn't been updated in months. The grass was cut, but not manicured. The flowers planted near the steps had grown in wild patches, half of them bent from sun or wind. It didn't look like a place people visited often, but it looked like somewhere people had once believed in something, and that was enough. The front door creaked when I opened it. The air inside was cool, still, and smelled of wood polish and old pages. There was no music, no sermon, no voices. Just a silence that felt lived in, not empty, but occupied by years of whispering hearts. Rows of wooden pews stretched forward, leading to a simple altar, bare but for a cross and a faded green cloth. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, and then stepped inside. Each step echoed lightly. I didn't rush. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my suitcase brushing against the wood. I didn't sit. I didn't pray. I just kept walking until I reached a side door near the pulpit that had been left slightly open. Behind it, a hallway led to a small kitchen. Linoleum floor, folding table, a coffee maker that looked older than I was. Beyond the kitchen was another door, this one marked Storage Office. I knocked softly out of instinct, even though no one had appeared. The door gave way with a gentle click. Inside was a modest room with a single bed against one wall, a narrow window, and a wooden dresser with a Bible resting on top. A chair sat in the corner, next to a lamp whose bulb flickered before finding its glow. The bed was neatly made, with a pale blue quilt. On the wall above it hung a framed verse I recognized, though the words escaped me in that moment. The room smelled faintly of dust, lavender, and something older, like cloth that had held the weight of many heads. I didn't know whose room it was. I didn't know if it was meant for someone or no one. But it didn't feel like trespassing. It felt like a pause, like a place between places. I left my suitcase by the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged slightly beneath me, not from wear, but from use. It had known bodies heavier than mine, grief deeper than mine, silence longer than mine. I removed my shoes. I rubbed my hands together. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees, breathing slowly. The quiet in that room was not empty. It filled me, stretched into the parts of my chest that had been clenched too long. I didn't cry. There was no sudden release, just stillness. Sometime later, I lay down. I didn't pull the quilt over me, just rested on top of it, staring at the ceiling. The window let in a slice of evening light that painted the opposite wall with soft gold. I watched the dust particles float in it like tiny things that had nowhere else to go. I must have dozed, because I awoke to the sound of a floorboard creaking. A man stood in the doorway, late 50s, perhaps older, dressed plainly. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked the way someone does when they find something right where it should be, even if they didn't know they were looking for it. He nodded once, gently, then disappeared down the hall without a word. I heard a door close in the distance. I didn't follow. I didn't feel afraid. That moment, that small, unspoken recognition, was enough. I stayed in the room. I stayed because it held me without asking who I was or what I had to offer. It didn't demand anything. It simply allowed me to be. In the morning, I rose before the sun again. My back ached less than usual. I washed my face in the small sink tucked beside the dresser, dried it with a towel that smelled like cedar. I brewed a cup of coffee from a dusty tin I found in the kitchen and drank it in the sanctuary, sitting in the second pew from the front. Light came through the stained glass in fragments, blue, red, green. It scattered across the floor in patterns that changed with the shifting sun. I sat there a long time, holding the warm cup between my hands, letting the silence settle in me like dust on an old piano. That day, I asked if I could stay and help. I didn't ask for charity. I asked for purpose. The man I'd seen, the pastor, though he never introduced himself that way, simply nodded. He pointed toward a cabinet of cleaning supplies and left me to it. I scrubbed floors, wiped windows, replaced light bulbs. I fixed a leaky faucet in the back bathroom. I found tools in the shed behind the building and repaired a broken bench outside. Each task was simple, and each one made me feel like a man again. Not a guest, not a burden, not an echo, but someone whose hands still knew what to do. At night, I returned to the quiet room. I unpacked my suitcase and folded my clothes into the dresser. I placed the photo of my wife on the nightstand, next to the flickering lamp. I sat in the chair by the window and listened to the crickets outside, the wind brushing against the walls like an old hymn, and I let myself feel something close to peace, not because everything was solved, not because I had found a new home, but because in that small room behind the sanctuary, I had found a space that asked nothing of me but presence. And for the first time in a long time, presence felt like enough. I had lived many years among walls that didn't care, walls that held silence not as comfort, but as indifference. In houses where my voice echoed only once, where no one answered unless something was needed. But the walls of the church were different. They didn't speak, but they listened. They held sound like memory, softly, without judgment, without urgency. They made space for things to breathe. Each morning I rose before the sun. It had become my rhythm, not out of habit now, but out of choice. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved from the bed to the sink. The light from the window came in slow and slanted, carrying with it the scent of dew and old wood. The silence of the room felt like a companion, not an absence. It greeted me gently, as if to say, "You are still here, and that is enough." After washing and dressing, I walked through the sanctuary before breakfast. I liked to pass through the pews while the stained glass was still dark, before the sun had colored it. There was a kind of honesty in that early dimness. The air was cool, and every sound, a breath, a footstep, felt larger than it was. I didn't need to speak. The room already knew what I was carrying. Some mornings, I sat in the second pew and ran my hand along the worn edge of the bench. The wood had been touched by so many, prayers, doubts, grief, hope, all etched invisibly into the grain. I imagined the stories it held: weddings, funerals, baptisms, confessions whispered into folded hands, joys shared in hymns sung off-key. The walls remembered, not in detail, but in presence. My tasks around the church became routine. I swept the steps, pulled weeds from the edges of the walk, tightened loose hinges, oiled the doors so they opened without groaning. I polished the brass on the altar and wiped down every bench. No one asked me to do these things. I did them because they needed doing, and because they reminded me of the man I used to be, a man with hands that could still serve. The pastor said little. He moved through the halls with quiet purpose, always a book in hand, always a nod of acknowledgement, never intrusion. He seemed to understand that I had come here not to be filled, but to empty something out, something heavy, something silent. And the church gave me room to do that. In the afternoons, I found myself lingering in the storage room behind the sanctuary. It smelled of cardboard and candles, old hymnals and forgotten banners. There was a window high on the wall that let in just enough light to make the dust visible as it floated in slow spirals. I sat there sometimes with my back against the shelf and just let the quiet soak into me. It was in that room that I began to hum again. I hadn't noticed it at first. A low sound, almost involuntary. Old songs I hadn't thought of in decades. Tunes from my childhood, from long car rides, from kitchen radios. The sound would rise in my throat without warning, and I would let it stay. The walls accepted it. They didn't require it to be beautiful. On one particular day, a storm rolled in. The sky turned the color of pewter, and the air shifted. Thunder cracked open the horizon, and rain battered the roof in waves. I stood in the sanctuary and watched the windows turn dark, the colors of the stained glass blurred by water. It felt like the world was weeping, but not in sorrow, in release. I walked the perimeter of the church during the downpour, checking windows, watching the rain snake down the walls. Inside, I noticed how the walls seemed to absorb the sound, not resist it, not amplify it, just hold it gently, like they were used to sorrow, like they had learned how to cradle it. Later, I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, my clothes still damp. I listened to the storm as it moved overhead, then slowly drifted east. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was layered, full of echoes. I realized then how deeply I had missed being in a place where quiet didn't mean forgotten. That night, I lay in bed without restlessness. I didn't count regrets. I didn't rehearse conversations that would never happen. I let the darkness hold me. And the walls, in their way, listened. They listened to everything I didn't say, to every moment I had been made to feel small, to every gesture that had gone unacknowledged, to every ache I had stored in the bend of my shoulders and the shuffle of my feet. They listened without rushing me, without asking me to explain. They simply received. And somehow, in that receiving, I began to remember myself again. Not the man I had become in recent years, quiet, careful, tolerated, but the man I had always been underneath. A man with calloused hands and a steady gaze. A man who had built, not just endured. The walls of that church didn't fix anything. They didn't change my past or erase the ache that still lived in my ribs like a second heartbeat. But they gave me a place to rest, to be seen without being examined, to be heard without speaking. And in that stillness, something in me began to heal. Quietly, patiently, as if the walls had always known how to hold what others had dropped. The phone had been off since I left, not powered down out of spite or fear, but because I didn't want to hear anything I wasn't ready to hear. I had slipped it into the side pocket of my suitcase the morning I walked away, like tucking away the last thread that connected me to the noise of that old life. It stayed there, untouched, silent, while the days passed in the quiet embrace of the church's walls. But something changed that night. It was a Tuesday. I remember because the choir usually practiced on Tuesdays, though they hadn't come this week. The building was still, unusually so, and I felt it in my bones as I moved through the halls. A different sort of silence. It didn't unsettle me. It simply reminded me that the world beyond those walls hadn't stopped turning, even if I had stepped off its spinning edge. I returned to my room early that evening. I had spent most of the day cleaning the shed behind the church, reorganizing tools, sweeping out years of dust and spiderwebs. My back ached more than usual. My fingers were raw from scrubbing, the kind of tired that came not from weakness, but from finally feeling useful again. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the suitcase in the corner, at the faint bulge where the phone still lay, powered off, forgotten. I don't know what made me reach for it. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was the way the wind had picked up, tapping tree branches against the window like fingers trying to remind me of something. Or maybe it was the simple fact that I had stopped running, not from a place, but from the sound of my own name. I pulled the suitcase toward me, unzipped the side pocket, and held the phone in my hand for a moment before pressing the button. The screen came to life in the dark. The date glowed unfamiliar. Notifications bloomed across the surface in clusters. But what struck me first was the number. 22 missed calls, most of them from my daughter. A few from numbers I didn't recognize. One from my grandson, marked with the small blue dot of a voicemail. I didn't press play. I just stared at the screen as it buzzed again in my hand. Call number 23, lighting up like a flare in the night. I didn't answer. Instead, I placed the phone on the dresser beside the bed. It buzzed again, minutes later. Then again. Each vibration sounded louder in the silence, like a pulse growing more frantic. I turned off the light and lay back in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The buzzing didn't stop. Every few minutes, it trembled against the wood like a trapped insect, persistent and rhythmic. I listened to each one. There was something strange in that, something humbling. To lie still and let someone want something from you again, not for labor or chores or obligation, but for presence, for answers, for the comfort of knowing where I was. It buzzed through dinner, through midnight, through the hours when the church creaked and settled and the world outside folded into sleep. I didn't count the calls anymore. I didn't look at the screen. I didn't move to silence it. I let it vibrate and vibrate and vibrate, like a heart that had finally remembered how to beat. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke just before dawn. The phone had gone quiet. The last message blinked on the screen. A new voicemail from my daughter, time-stamped just after 3 a.m. I didn't open it. I simply stared at it as the sun began to rise, painting a stripe of soft gold across the floor. I made coffee. I drank it slowly. I washed the cup, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf. Then I returned to the dresser and picked up the phone. It felt lighter than the night before. I didn't return the call. I didn't send a message. I didn't write an explanation. But I didn't turn it off either. I carried it in my pocket as I swept the chapel floor. Not because I needed it, but because I had chosen, finally, to be the one who decides when to speak and when to stay silent. It was a morning without color. The kind where the sky looked unfinished, the light a dull silver that flattened everything it touched. I stood by the window in the quiet room and watched the fog cling to the grass outside the church, softening edges, erasing distance. My hands were wrapped around my coffee cup, though the coffee had gone cold long ago. The phone sat on the dresser beside me, silent now. It hadn't buzzed in over a day. I didn't know what made me decide that morning. I hadn't planned it. There was no voice in the night, no epiphany while brushing my teeth or folding my shirt. Just a slow understanding that I had something left to give. Not to them, but to myself. A closing of a door, not with bitterness, but with precision. I opened the drawer beneath the bed and pulled out the manila envelope. It had lived there, untouched, since the day I arrived. I had packed it without thinking, a habit born of years working with documents, pay stubs, contracts, papers that proved a life had been lived. This envelope was heavier than most, not with volume, but with meaning. Inside were records. Not many, but enough. Photocopies of mortgage payments, bank transfers, property tax statements. all of them bearing my name alongside my daughter's and her husband's. Years ago, I had helped them buy that house, not in cash, but with backing, with credit, with co-signatures and monthly support when their jobs were unsteady, when the market dipped, when the pipes burst and insurance didn't cover the full repair. I never boasted, never reminded them, never kept score, but I had kept proof, not for leverage, not for revenge, but because I was raised to keep records, raised to understand that paper holds weight when memory fails, raised to know that sometimes the only thing that keeps a man from vanishing is ink on a page. I took the envelope and slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat. It fit perfectly, like it had always belonged there. I zipped up the suitcase again, not that I expected to stay away long, but because carrying something familiar gave my body a rhythm. I told the pastor I'd be out for the day. He nodded, didn't ask. He knew the look of a man who had something to do. The town hadn't changed. Same streets, same cracks in the sidewalk, same impatient drivers rolling through yellow lights. But walking through it now, I felt different. Not like someone returning, but like someone passing through, already halfway gone. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac with trimmed hedges and 2 flower pots on the porch. The front yard had been cleaned up since I left. The grass cut closer, the hedges tighter, the welcome mat straightened. It all looked a little too precise, like someone was trying to make the place forget that I had ever walked its floors. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't knock. I didn't want to see their faces or hear their voices. I didn't want apologies or explanations. Didn't want my name spoken in a tone that twisted regret into defense. I wasn't there for words. I was there to leave something behind. The mailbox was a metal one, painted black, attached to the siding by 2 screws that were beginning to rust. I opened it slowly, careful not to let it clang. The space inside was empty. I took the envelope from my coat and slid it in, closing the flap with the gentleness one reserves for something sacred. Inside the envelope, on top of the documents, I had placed a short note. Handwritten, no more than 2 sentences. I may be gone, but I was never absent. This house was never free. That was all. No signature, no accusation, just the truth, laid bare on paper. As I turned to leave, I heard something. The muffled sound of movement from inside. Curtains shifting. A floorboard creaking near the entrance. I didn't wait to see if anyone opened the door. I stepped off the porch and walked down the path, my feet landing steady on the stone. The sidewalk led to a small park I used to take my grandson to when he was little. I passed the swing set and the wooden bench with initials carved into the side. My legs carried me without question, the way they used to when I worked long shifts and came home to mow the lawn before sunset. They remembered what it meant to go forward. There was a staircase at the edge of the park, old concrete, 6 steps leading down to the trail that curved around the creek. I paused at the top, one hand resting on the cold metal railing. The air was damp. The sky had begun to lighten, the fog lifting in fragments. Below, the trail was empty. I stood there a long time, not thinking, just standing. And then, slowly, I descended. Each step felt deliberate, not heavy, but certain. Like I was walking into a version of my life that didn't need approval or recognition. The staircase didn't lead anywhere in particular. It just brought me down to a quieter path. A path I could take without being watched. A path I could walk without being told who to be. At the bottom, I turned left and began to move. The creek beside me whispered against the rocks, and the trees leaned just enough to form a corridor of soft green light. I didn't look back. Not at the stairs, not at the park, not at the house I had left behind. I kept walking, not because I was lost, but because, for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I wasn't going. There was a closet in the back of the church, not the one near the sanctuary where they kept extra hymnals, or the one off the kitchen filled with folding chairs and paper towels. This closet was smaller, tucked behind the office, almost hidden in the bend of a narrow hallway. I found it one day while cleaning, the door slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting to be opened. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the kind of scent that only comes from time and things left alone. There were coats hanging along the rod, old garments in plastic dry cleaner bags, forgotten or left behind by people who had come through the church before me. Some were formal, some were simple, but all of them bore the scent of lives that had once touched them. And then there was the fabric. Folded neatly on the top shelf, half covered by an old wool blanket, was a coat. Not expensive, not tailored, but strong. The color was something between gray and green, the lining stitched by hand in uneven but careful seams. When I reached for it, the fabric unfolded with a softness I didn't expect, not from use, but from meaning. It didn't resist me. It settled into my hands as if it had been waiting. I held it up and pressed it to my face. The smell was subtle, not perfume, not soap, but something earthy. Something like wind and old books and tobacco leaf. It wasn't just a coat. It was a memory made of thread. It didn't smell like anyone I knew, but it smelled like freedom. Like the first day you realize you don't have to ask permission to be yourself. I put it on. It fit, not perfectly. The sleeves were a bit short, the shoulders a little wide, but it fit the way borrowed strength fits a man who's been worn thin. Not exact, but enough. I walked through the halls of the church wearing it, just to feel it move with me. It rustled quietly, the fabric brushing against itself in a rhythm that made me feel less alone. That day, the sun came out after a week of overcast skies. Light poured through the stained glass windows and painted the sanctuary in warm, fractured color. I sat in the pew wearing the coat, hands resting in the pockets, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was taking up space. I felt placed, like I had arrived somewhere not because I was allowed, but because I belonged. I kept the coat, not out of need, I had others, but because it had spoken to something I had forgotten in myself. I wore it each day after that. When I swept the entryway, when I sat on the back steps watching the sun rise, when I visited the town's small library and returned with a book of poetry I hadn't read since high school. I started walking longer distances, down the trail past the creek, through the neighborhoods I didn't know, past strangers who didn't look at me as someone left behind, but as someone simply passing through. The coat moved with me like a quiet affirmation, a declaration stitched not in words, but in wear. One afternoon, I visited a thrift store on the edge of town. I didn't need anything, but something pulled me in. The place smelled like old furniture and forgotten things. In the back, past the books and records, was a table covered with folded fabrics, tablecloths, scarves, old curtains. I ran my hand across them and felt their stories. Parties once hosted, meals once shared, windows once opened to let in spring air. I bought a scarf, deep blue, frayed at the ends. I didn't know why. It reminded me of the sea, though I hadn't seen it in years. I wrapped it loosely around my neck as I walked back to the church, the ends trailing behind me in the wind. People must have thought I looked strange, an old man in a green-gray coat and a blue scarf walking without a destination. But I didn't care. The fabric caught the breeze, and I felt weightless. That night, I sat in my room with the window open. The scarf rested on the chair, the coat draped over the foot of the bed. The air smelled of pine and faint smoke from someone burning leaves nearby. I watched the curtain dance with the wind and thought about how long it had been since I had done anything just because I wanted to. No schedule, no expectation, just a choice. I lit a candle, not for ceremony, not for memory, just to see the light flicker across the wall. I watched it for what felt like hours, the shadows shifting, the flames steady. I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel needed. I felt like a man who had stepped outside the tight script of his old life and found himself in a slower, deeper rhythm. And in that quiet, with the candle flickering and the wind moving through fabric I had chosen, I understood something I hadn't before. Freedom wasn't loud. It wasn't a banner or a battle cry. It wasn't a declaration made to others. It was the moment you stop asking whether you have the right to feel joy, and just feel it. The calls had stopped. The messages, too. For a while they came in clusters, desperate, uncertain, confused. Then they trickled down into quieter, more hesitant taps. And then nothing. The phone lay on my dresser each night, untouched, screen dark. It didn't light up anymore, and I never reached for it. I had learned that silence doesn't have to be filled. It can exist as its own answer. I had expected that someone might come, not dramatically, not in a storm of apologies, but maybe quietly. A knock at the church door, a figure standing in the back during a service. But no one did. Days passed, and I remained unvisited. The pews were filled with strangers. Their prayers were their own, and mine stayed wordless. I didn't speak about where I came from. No one asked. Each morning, I dressed slowly, methodically, like I was still working a job. I washed my face, combed my hair, made my bed with corners tight enough to pass an old army check. My coat waited on the back of the chair, the scarf hung by the window, the candle stub resting in its dish. These small arrangements became my language, my quiet way of saying I was still here, still whole, still capable of care. The sanctuary grew familiar in its hush. I knew where the floor creaked near the pulpit. I knew which pew had a carved cross barely visible unless the light hit just right. I knew the hum the lights made before warming the room, the way the stained glass turned bold around noon, then softened again by 3. I became part of that rhythm, not center stage, not behind the curtain, just quietly within it. Sometimes I sat outside the church after evening chores were done, the sky darkening above the trees. The town grew quiet then, the traffic distant, the birds gone to sleep. The wind would rise from the east and rustle the leaves in that slow, thoughtful way that made it feel like the world was remembering itself. I would close my eyes and listen, and I never broke the silence. Not when I passed the park where I used to push my grandson on the swings, not when I saw a familiar car parked near the market, not when I walked past a mailbox that once carried letters with my name on the return address. I didn't speak to old neighbors. I didn't reply to distant relatives. I didn't correct the records or defend my absence. I let my leaving be what it was, a line drawn not in anger, but in clarity. The kind of line a man draws when he finally understands that being needed is not the same as being valued. One afternoon, I walked the trail by the creek again, the same path I'd taken after leaving the house. The water still moved in the same soft current, carrying leaves and twigs and forgotten things downstream. I found the bench where I had once rested, and I sat again, not out of exhaustion, but out of acknowledgement. I placed my hands on my knees and looked straight ahead. A boy rode past on a bicycle, legs pumping furiously, the back wheel squealing slightly. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. I wasn't a landmark in his world, just a man sitting still. And that felt right. That felt enough. Behind the church, the garden had started to bloom. Not much, just a few stubborn shoots of green, a patch of yellow near the fence where someone must have planted daffodils years ago. I tended to it without being asked. Pulled weeds, cleared debris, watered the soil. I didn't expect anything to grow quickly. Some things take longer. Some things bloom only when no one's watching. One morning, the pastor left a note on my pillow, just a folded sheet of paper with a single sentence. "You've done more here than you realize." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We had our own language now, one that didn't require noise. I continued my days as I had, steady, unassuming, useful. I became a fixture in the way that old buildings do, not flashy, not fragile, but constant. And all the while, I kept the silence. I didn't tell them where I was. I didn't ask how they were doing. I didn't explain the envelope or the stairs or the fabric I had chosen to carry forward. Some silences are not about absence. They are a form of presence, one that says, I am still myself, even when you're no longer looking. And in that silence, I healed. Not loudly, not all at once, but thoroughly, quietly, like water smoothing stone. Until one day, I stopped measuring the distance between who I was and who I had become, because I no longer needed the noise of recognition. I had found the dignity of being unseen and the peace that follows when you stop trying to be heard by those who never learned how to listen.